Welcome back to Great Lakes Junction, everyone. We're back to working on the 65 Ford again today. Well, this time we're going to try a bigger project. We're going to see if we can remove the steering box on this car. It was quite sloppy when we bought the car, and we had the power steering pump rebuilt, hooked it all up, put the belt on the power steering pump, started the car up, and without anyone being near the car, the front wheels were turning to the left very slowly all by themselves. And we talked to some people about it at the time, and they said the seals inside the steering box were gone and fluid was being pumped around to the wrong side, and that's what was causing the wheels to turn on their own. So we disconnected the power steering pump, that is, took the belt off, and we never did anything further. And we've been driving it like that now as standard steering for about 7 years, but the steering box is getting more and more play in it. It's starting to drip fluid out of the steering box. The seals in the shaft are so wobbly, and I'm starting to get very concerned about losing steering while I'm driving. So it's time to try and get the steering box out of this car and replace it. So where we're at so far, we've got the car jacked up on axle stands, and the Pitman Arm, maybe I should lay down in here and give you a better view. So here's this big nut, holds the Pitman Arm to the bottom of our steering gearbox. And I don't have a socket that big, and it's too close up in here to get in with any sort of other tool or wrench or anything. So I'm going to leave the Pitman Arm connected to the steering box, and we'll disconnect the other end of this is the Pitman Arm here coming down, and the other end of it, this is like a ball joint in the end here that connects on this steering linkage. So I've removed the nut, and I've already used a separator tool in here because these are usually a tapered fit. So we've hammered the separating tool in here, and it's already started to pull this down. So we'll finish pulling this down. I was a little bit concerned about how tough this might be to get out, but it seems to be coming out not too bad. So we'll disconnect that completely, and then we'll start disconnecting the steering column from the box and the fluid lines off of that steer box. Okay. Our power steering pump on here is still full of fluid even though it's not being used. So we've had the belt off of it now all these years. So the lines on the back, this is the high pressure line, the supply line. It's higher than the fluid level in the pump. So we can disconnect it here without any fluid leaking out. The return line is much lower on the pump. So rather than disconnect it there, I went down, you can't really see it from here, where that red rag is. Well, there's the high pressure line, down where that red rag is that goes into it, and the return line came out right next to it. So I was able from underneath to reach up around and disconnect the return line from there. The supply line was too tight to get enough leverage on it to take it off in the same spot. So we've actually essentially got the lines disconnected. That supply line will come out with the pump, and then we'll just take it off later once we get it out in the open. Our next thing is going to be to undo the bolts on the steering column now, which is just above that red rag there. There's a odd looking coupler assembly. So we'll move on to removing the bolts on that next. Okay, so what you're looking at there, this is the top of our steering box here. This is the part we're removing. I just took that red rag out of the way. This is where the return line was in that we took out there. Now there's a coupler right there that I'm touching with the end of that ruler. And the bolt that goes through there that I just took out, it's a 7/16 12-point head on the bolt. So I took that bolt out, put a screwdriver in this location and just pried it a little bit, because that is a splined shaft that comes out of the steering box or steering gear. So it just pried that coupler back off of the splines of that shaft. So with that undone, the ball joint underneath undone, and the lines undone, I think we're ready to tackle the main bolts that hold that thing into the car and remove it from the car. Then we can worry about getting the Pitman Arm off and this high pressure line out of it once we get it out, and it's easier to get at. So we got the gearbox out, or steering box rather. We got the steering box out of the car. That one supply line was very easy to get at, and it came out very easy once we had the box out of the car. The bolts that go through the frame to bolt this on, one of them, the head wanted to strip on it, and we ended up, it was a 3/4 inch head, and it rounded the corners off. So we ended up driving an 18mm socket on with a hammer to get a nice tight fit, and then it was able to get that last bolt out. So this is the Pitman arm that I said in the car. There just wasn't enough room for leverage to get this big nut off of here. That's the nut. And I didn't have a wrench that big. The only thing I had that actually would go that big is a pipe wrench. And I didn't have my little vise that you've seen in previous videos. It wouldn't hold the steering box. So I just drilled a couple of holes through the front of the workbench, and we just bolted it back onto the workbench. Put the pipe wrench on, cracked it loose, no problem. So now we just have to try and get this arm off. I'm sure it's a press fit, probably all original, been on there for nearly 60 years. So we'll see what kind of a job it is to force that off of there. Well, we got our Pitman arm off. So this is the puller that we used. It's still a little warm on the hands. Ouch. So basically, that sits in there. Those two arms grab on underneath the Pitman arm. We put a ratchet on the top, tighten it up. We tightened it up till it had a fair bit of pressure on it. It was getting very hard to turn. And then I put a torch on there to give it a little bit of heat. Once we got it heated up, just using a regular small propane torch like you might have around for plumbing purposes. Once we got enough heat built up in it, gave it one more little turn, and it popped that Pitman arm right off of there. Off of that spline shaft. So that's the last piece we had to take off. Now there's a couple of shops around. One claims to still rebuild these old things, so I need to get in touch with them and find out if they're still open and how much they would charge, how long it would take to get this rebuilt, and we'll put it back in the car. Well, we have the steering gearbox all rebuilt now. They did a wonderful job. Very happy with it. Even the original Ford Motor Company tag with all the part numbers and stuff on here, they even cleaned that up and put that back on. The shafts, they must have dunked this thing because the shafts, everything looks like brand new in it. So we have that all rebuilt. It was 300 with tax, was around 350 bucks, and it only took them 3 days to do it. So very happy how that came out. We've been under the car where this came off of. We had some power steering fluid and we took the lines off. There was fluid in the lines and it ran down the frame and stuff like that. So we took some engine degreaser under there, sprayed it all down with an old, and then used an old paintbrush to brush it off so it's nice and clean. Made sure the mounting surface where this is going to bolt onto the side of the frame, made sure there was no clumps of grease or dirt or anything that had gotten on the frame there, because we want a nice flush tight fit when we bolt this thing back up. Now we did have the front wheels of the car, can't really tell from here, the front wheels, when we were moving everything around and disconnecting under there, the front wheels, we actually had to turn the front wheels a little bit to get at that bolt where the actual steering column bolts on. So I just jacked this corner up just enough to get that tire off the floor so I could turn the tire so that it looks like it's straight. Now I'm just eyeballing, I got nothing to measure from. So I eyeballed down the side of this front tire to the side of the rear tire, and they look like they're in line with one another. So I'm going to assume that that is straight. Our steering wheel, you can see the horn ring there in the steering wheel, it's straight across, so everything is in a straightforward position. So now hopefully when we bolt this back in, the end of the steering column shaft that goes on here, they're relatively close together, the splines that are in here. So if it's not, the first time we put it in, bolt everything in, and if once we get everything set back down on the ground, if we find out that horn ring in the middle of the steering wheel is a little off center, we can undo the nut that holds this together, lift that steering column off, turn it a tooth or two, and put it back on until our steering wheel is straight again. As for the Pitman arm, there's only two positions. I don't know if I can get this on camera. So it's teeth all the way around, and then it's like there's a tooth missing. There's a flat spot there, and there's another one on this side. So there's only two positions that Pitman arm can go in. So after we get that bolted back into the car, it's going to be obvious as to which one of those two positions, because it's a 180-degree difference. So it'll be obvious where it goes. Well, actually, two of them must have been filled in with crud when we took it apart, because now I see there's four of them at 90-degree angles from one another. So there's four positions it can go in. But again, it should be relatively easy to find out which of the four that's going to go in, because we have this ball joint on the end that has to connect to the steering linkage as well. So if you're off by 90 degrees, you're going to know it. That's where we're at. So here's our coupler that comes off the end of the steering shaft. Now that only goes on there one way. There's an alignment pin here, and this one's much smaller than that one. So that'll only go on the end of the steering column in one way. This is where the spline shaft on the end of that steering gear fits into. And now that I've got this off and I see it in the light, there's actually only one way it'll go on also. So where I was thinking that the teeth were close together and we could have taken it off, moved it one teeth or something and put back on to line up the steering wheel, we're not going to have to do that, because this is only going to go on one way. They've basically doubled up like one tooth space in there, so it's extra wide. So it's only going to go on that shaft in one position only. So there's our coupler that I just showed you on the workbench. Now it's back on the shaft on the end of the steering gear. The steering gear itself weighs about 30 pounds, which isn't a heavy weight when you're carrying it around, but when you're laying under the car and your arms are bent in an awkward position and you're trying to hold that up in there and get bolts in, it feels like a lot more than 30 pounds in those positions. So there's one bolt holding it now. So I had a bolt started through the frame, was able to get that up into position, and I had somebody else just thread that bolt into the housing to hold it there. So now we can pivot it around on that bolt to line up the rest of them and hopefully line that coupler back up also. There's our coupler all put back together on the bottom of the steering column. Those two orange rings you see, those are plugs that are in the ports where the lines go, just to keep dirt from falling in there. So we have that tightened up now to the frame. So we haven't tightened any of the bolts on that coupler there yet, just in case things need to move around a bit. Now we're going to go under and put the Pitman arm back on next. So we've got our lines done up down there on the steering box now, and got the lines done up on the back of the power steering pump. I know that looks like a kink in the line there, but it's just the way the shadow is. There's not actually a kink in it. We've got our belt back on and tensioned up. Now we're just waiting. Someone's run out to get us some more fluid. So it is just about to the full limit of where it's supposed to be right now, but we haven't run it yet. So I suspect that's going to pump the majority of that into that steering box, and we're going to have more fluid to refill the reservoir. So we're just waiting for someone to come back with another bottle of fluid for us. Well, another job finished up. So we've warmed it up, topped up the fluid, made sure it got hot. checked for leaks. We have no leaks on any of our line connections. So I think we're good there. So once again, that's it for this video and the 65 Ford. Thank you very much for watching.